You are listening to 90.1 FM, KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio. Stay tuned for the Heartland Labor Forum, radio that talks back to the boss.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear their voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all...
Dear friends, welcome to Labor Radio Podcast Network Profile Series, highlighting the work of network members. The growing network of over 70 shows in 4 countries serves as a one-stop shop for audiences looking for labor content and as a resource for labor broadcasters, podcasters, and content producers. My name is Evan Papp, and I produce Empathy Media Lab's podcast on labor, political economy, arts, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Judy Ancel of the Heartland Labor Forum. So Judy, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what led you to organize labor.
Oh shoot! I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem.
I got to take this. It's
a
gift.
Please.
Hello.
Hi, is Judy there?
That's me.
Hi, Judy. This is Linda Featherston returning your call.
Oh, good. Hi. So, did you understand my message?
So yes, what I think is, are you going to do an interview or a labor radio show?
It's
Thursday afternoon.
It's Thursday afternoon, and I will invite your opponent. I don't know if he'll come on or not, but yeah, we're going to have several questions aimed at working class issues, and we will ask the both of you to respond, and let you respond to one another. Anyway,
oh God, yeah.
the motto of our show is radio that talks back to the boss, so you can get the idea.
All right.
Okay.
Good to know.
Thanks, Linda.
Yeah.
Bye.
Sure. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Bye.
Well, I don't know if you want to use any of that.
Yes. I love it.
Well, I am professionally a labor educator and retired a couple of years ago after 29 years running a labor education program at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I originally come from Chicago, and I grew up there in a kind of blue-collar working class town called Maywood outside of Chicago, and learned a little bit about unions because there were a lot of unions around at the time. There were steel workers, there were teachers unions, and so on and so forth. But I really didn't have any direct experience until I became a community college teacher, or at least I wanted to become a community college teacher. And I was living in the Bay Area at that time. This was in the 70s. And lo and behold, I entered the job market the same year that the community colleges discovered the miracle of adjuncts. And I applied for jobs all over. And I was told, yeah, we have plenty of part-time jobs for you. But if you want a full-time job, come back in about 20 years because we're full up. And so I ended up teaching at one semester I taught at 5 different colleges, and was zooming. I was one of these freeway people, was zooming around from college to college. And at one of the colleges, I ran into a table of people who were recruiting for a part-time teachers association. And I said, oh, goody. And so I joined, and this part-time teachers association grew, actually sued the state of California for tenure rights to our jobs, because we were mainly working at part-time at public school community colleges. And then we joined the AFT, and eventually I sort of settled in working in the San Mateo Community College District and a couple of schools there. and I got active in the AFT there and became an organizer, was hired as an organizer about the time that California got collective bargaining for public employee for teachers. And so I kind of cut my teeth learning how to organize. And so that was my first union experience. And then later on, I moved to Kansas City, and I actually went to work in a factory and joined the Steelworkers Union. I was a lathe machinist and activist and troublemaker in the Steelworkers Union for about 5 years before I became a labor educator.
That's an incredible story on how you came to labor. And what was it like in the American Federation of Teachers back then? I'm sure like every organization changes over time. Was it more militant, or was it a little more subdued?
That was the Al Shanker years. And I had actually been introduced to Al Shanker earlier because I was a VISTA volunteer in New York City in 1968 during the famous school strike over community control of the schools. And Shanker was leading the union in what was perceived by the minority community as a really racist strike. And it was really one of these setups where the progressive movement could only lose, and they did big time. It was a big split, I think, in progressives right at the beginning of the Nixon era. And so Shanker took over the national union, and so it was pretty conservative. But in California, winning the right to collective bargaining was a huge breakthrough for teachers. And there was a lot of organizing going on in the community colleges, especially, and so hotly contested between the several different unions who wanted to represent them. So, it was a good experience. It was a good learning experience for me. But it was very, very different than working in factories after that. In a way, I kind of got disgusted with organizing faculty. I thought they didn't understand their own self-interest. And many of them just wanted to close the doors of their offices and do their research, or, do their reading and not be bothered by reminders that they still were working class. Even though they thought they'd escaped the working class. And so I went to work in factories. I worked in Silicon Valley for a while, non-union, tried to organize a union, which was a really interesting experience, and failed because we couldn't get a union to agree to take on the company we worked for because it was huge. And we had an organizing committee, and it was really disappointing when we couldn't get a union to represent us. And then after I moved to Kansas City and I joined the Steelworkers and worked in a factory, I got to see what a more traditional union was like, industrial union, and had lots of really great experiences of solidarity.
That's an incredible story. There's so many follow-up questions.
It's been fun.
Yeah. So in California, was there ever an effort or an attempt to reach out to the National Labor Relations Board at that time to help with the organizing, or was it more of locally and state focused and just trying to get it together?
Well, with community college teachers, the NLRB wasn't involved because they are state employees. And in the electronics industry, we never got to that point. The company we worked for, which doesn't exist anymore, it merged into a bunch of other companies. We actually made electron tubes. I worked for 2 years under a microscope. Aside from affecting my eyesight, it was not a very interesting job, I have to say. A lot of chemicals. And I think the workers would have moved, but the company found out that there was organizing going on, and they just started terrorizing us, and people were scared to death. So I learned what a powerful company like that could do to intimidate workers. And as you know, Silicon Valley is almost entirely non-union to this day.
So that brings me to the next question, labor news. A lot of people my age have grown up where there was no labor columns in the newspaper. There's almost no coverage of labor or this class consciousness. And so could you talk a little bit about why you think unions and organized labor are important, and why you're spending your time covering it with the Heartland Labor Forum.
Well, yeah, our show started a long time ago. It started in 1989, and it started when basically just a short time after our community radio station was founded, which was a huge opportunity. We got a show because the IBEW wired the station for free. And in exchange, they were given the right to have a show. And I had just gotten my job as a labor educator at the university, and they said, oh, let's go get her to do it. And so the Labor Council came and they said, would you be interested? And, and we recruited a number of volunteers from the unions and began what is called at our station a group show. I mean, because we have different producers every week, and we have lots of people involved, which is great. So why cover labor news and labor issues? Well, that's where most of the people are. Most of the people are workers, and they don't get news in the mainstream media. The decline of labor coverage just in the last 20, 30 years has been, horrible. Nobody's a full-time labor reporter anymore. We used to have a bunch of them. We used to have people who understood labor issues who were reporting on strikes and contract negotiations and organizing drives. And now the people who come to cover have very little expertise. They don't understand what's going on. So it's really important to have shows that focus on issues and report them from the point of view of the workers and know what they're talking about. And so this whole series of labor shows that we have across the country, I think is a really important addition to the whole media market that exists.
So I've spent my entire life growing up in the Reagan arena, as I like to hear referred to it, for 40 years. And I think we're moving into a new arena, and it can go much worse, or I think it can go better. But covering labor, you've seen labor change over the last 30 years with the Heartland Labor Forum. What are some of your, I guess, what have you taken away? What are some of the highlights that you've seen that have stuck with you when you're thinking about the coverage over the last 30 years?
Well, I remember our first show. In fact, we still have it on our webpage. It was, we covered the Eastern Airlines strike, which had just begun when we went on the air. And, we were out there with our clunky tape recorders, doing, interviewing, recording speeches and stuff like that. And didn't know what we were doing. I mean, we were total technical novices. But we captured a lot of the spirit of that strike that was, it had picket lines here in Kansas City at the Kansas City airport, and people got arrested. And I think at that time we had much more hope for an earlier fight back against sort of the onslaught that had been happening since Reagan. I mean, that was 1989, and we still really believed that like things could turn around fast, and as time has progressed, I've noticed that the decline shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up in the willingness to share news on the part of union leaders. It shows up in the lack of attention in the media to labor. And yet there's always been this crew of people who have hope that labor is this year is going to be the year of the resurgence of labor. And we go out and we cover these things. And, people are always trying. I think one of the things that's really impressed me is how stalwart working people are and how much patience people actually have We were just covering a strike in St. Joseph, Missouri a couple of weeks ago, where they've been on strike for, 6 weeks now. It's a company that makes cans for dog food. And the workers are not very well paid. They're members of the sheet metal workers. And they are not well educated. There's very little labor education that's going on these days. But yet they know when they're really being threatened, and they know what's on the line, and they're holding up. We went to a rally in pouring rain, and people stood there for 2 hours in pouring rain. It wasn't very hot, it was warm, rallying in front of the manager's house. And like that kind of belief that your struggle can make a difference is something that just keeps me going all the time.
That is part of the hope that I'm finding, and the inspiration from the workers who, against all odds, are still standing up to the bosses, which is a part of your show as well. And
yeah, and those are the really interesting stories, that you get. I tend to not interview very many union leaders because they feel constraints that rank and filers don't feel, because they're political beings and they're always thinking about the next election and how the membership is going to react to this statement or that statement. And so you don't get a lot of that fighting spirit from them that makes good radio.
Yeah, and especially the Democratic Party for my adult life operating in the Reagan arena. You got Bill Clinton, who really, I didn't see much support. The movement from the New Deal Democrats to the New Democrats under Clinton, and even going into the Obama administration, that's a part of it. And it seems like the Democratic Party, in a lot of ways, because of their abandoning, at least not having labor in center out in front, ceded a lot of ground to reactionaries over the many years. So,
well, try coming to the Midwest, because so many of our politicians are extremely cautious and averse to taking on controversial issues, averse to looking too militant. And it's really funny because one of the things we covered was primaries, and there was a huge contingent both in 2016 and this year for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders won the Kansas primary, believe it or not, in 2016. And there are these people who simply go way beyond what the establishment Democrat politicians are willing to do. So that's interesting to me. I think it's also rather sad that there's so little daring in among the political class.
Another show that you did was on unionization of nonprofits, and living in Washington, D.C. I was born in Cleveland, have a lot of family in the industrial parts that are now much of the Rust Belt, grew up in Michigan, lived in Chicago for a while. So I am very aware of that reactionary element, but I've been in D.C. for the last 13 years. And I've lived in that nonprofit world, a lot of it in international development. And there's this do-gooder spirit and mentality, yet you did some coverage on some nonprofits that are actually anti-union and doing some union busting. I don't know if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, well, we were specifically covering the unionization attempt at the ACLU of Kansas, which, these are the folks that really significantly helped defeat Chris Kobach, who was the racist Trump supporter who was previously Secretary of State of Kansas. And, in many ways, they were heroes to me of the work they had done. And when they started to, and when they became extremely anti-union, I thought it was an aberration among the ACLU. I've come to find out that no, there's a number of ACLUs around the country that have encountered similar things, maybe not as egregious, but the ACLU nationally is undergoing a union drive right now, which the management is opposing. So it's very, very disillusioning to me that nonprofits, and they're not the only ones by any means, that nonprofits are, threatened by their own workers instead of understanding that their workers are the lifeblood of their organization. I mean, I look at the work of the ACLU of Kansas, and it's not the management people who are inspiring people and building the organization. It's the field staff, and they've been absolutely trampled upon.
And just one more question about some of the content on your show. You also have covered meat packers and COVID, and that's very much a part of industries in the Midwest as well. Can you talk a little bit about some of the coverage you've done on that?
It's hard the meatpacking, there's only one very small meatpacking company in Kansas City. Most of them are scattered, but there's a bunch. There's a huge number out in western Kansas that are unionized, mostly, some of them are unionized with UFCW. I'm most familiar with a Smithfield plant in Milan, Missouri, which is a really small, isolated community in north central Missouri, where they produce pork. And so I got involved because I'm actually on the board of the Worker Center there. And I became aware of the fact that there was this nonprofit in Washington that was interested in, it's called Public Justice. It was interested in holding the packing houses accountable for health and safety during COVID. And so they sued them. And so we covered that. They sued him for actually creating a public nuisance, which I thought was great. And it was thrown out in the courts. The courts deferred to OSHA, which was doing nothing. So we covered all of those kinds of issues. We even got an interview with somebody from the Department of Labor in DC about the CARES Act and, and also, what they were doing to try to protect workers. So we try to cover it from that angle too.
I met you through the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Could you talk a little bit about why you think such a network is important?
Sure. Back in the 90s, we had an organization called UPNET, Union Producers and Programmers Network. There weren't that many of us, but maybe a dozen at the most, probably fewer than that. We were all volunteers. There were some video programmers as well as audio, radio. We didn't have podcasts then. And we kept trying to interest the AFL-CIO in supporting us in helping to publicize the importance of alternative media. And we were trying to convince people at that time that, convince the labor movement and labor leaders that their reliance on the mainstream media was, not a very useful approach because they weren't making any headway. And as we've seen, the mainstream media has really shifted any focus away from labor, unless there's a strike. And we failed in that. We had some great conferences. We shared technical information, but it eventually just petered out. And I think it petered out from a lot of lack of interest from labor. And I guess the time just wasn't right. So when I heard about the Labor Radio Podcast Network and talked to Chris Garlock and got an idea of how ambitious a project this was, and then began attending the meetings, I saw that, that they had a little more backing, for one. There were many more shows and podcasts than I realized around the country. And so I decided to put some time into it because I think that it's really a worthwhile venture. I think that maybe, the AFL-CIO is waking up to the fact that this is a resource for them, and they should support it. And I'm hopeful that there will be more support for our endeavors in that. I think that the alternative media has become much bigger than it was then, back in the 90s. Lots of people, for good and for ill, are listen to alternative media, listen to podcasts, and so I think there's a lot of potential.
Well, it's kind of related to my final question. So looking into the future of organized labor, where do you see opportunity and hope?
Well, as they always say, it's the bad bosses that get unions. I think we have a bumper crop of them, around, and the bad politicians as well. I think the times are really changing and making a possibility of a resurgence of the labor movement quite likely. I think we're already seeing it. We're seeing an increase in strikes. We're seeing an increase in organizing. And I think we're seeing a really vastly changed consciousness among young workers who understand much clearer than I think people in my generation or your generation did, which is they understand that this is a class struggle and that the two sides are not going to work it out, and that you got to fight. So that's the main thing I see as far as hope is concerned. I think that our efforts gives me some hope. And one thing I wish, one thing I wish is that the unions would invest more in labor education. I mean, and that isn't just self-serving because I'm a labor educator, but when I look at the consciousness of union members 40 years ago, 50 years ago, versus what it is today, the level of education about unions, labor history, how do you struggle, what strategy, how do you understand your own interests, it's super declined. And I think it's totally linked to the fact that unions in around the 1980s basically stopped educating their members. And if they did any education, it was very technical education, like shop steward training. Maybe this has been going on longer than that. Maybe it's been going on since the anti-communist movement, but McCarthyism. And there was a great deal of fear of, like even using the word class. When I got involved in labor education, which was late 80s and early 90s, there was still a tremendous amount of fear of being red baited within the labor movement just for trying to teach people what their own economic self-interest were. And so, like labor itself does not understand or appreciate the importance of real, sort of political economy and teaching political economy to the members so that, they understand the trajectory of a movement. So that's an ingredient that I'd really like to see developed more. I hope it does.
Well, shows like yours are helping to educate people like me, and I'm doing what I can to learn and create my own content and distribute it far and wide. And
well, that's great, because I think you do great work. And some of the people I've met in the network are inspiring to me because of the work they're doing, and they're teaching me things for sure.
And same. I'm just so humbled to be around. Your experience and depth in labor organizing, just being on the airwaves for 30 years. For someone pretty new to this game, I have nothing but gratitude and humbleness.
Thank you.
And so really appreciate.
It's a labor of love, let me say. It really is.
Yeah. Well, Judy Ancel of the Heartland Labor Forum, thanks so much for talking today.
Well, thank you, Evan. It was fun.
better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear their voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, if one of us is chained, none of us are free, 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 if one of us is chained, none of us are free. There are people in darkness, they just can't see the light. If we don't